Selin Anderson had been invisible for exactly 3 years and 2 months. And tonight, being invisible was about to change everything. She moved through the garden terrace with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to disappear in plain sight, her hands steady as she arranged fresh orchids on the mahogany host stand. The upscale Korean fusion restaurant hummed with the quiet wealth of Seattle's Belltown elite, the soft clink of crystal, muted conversations about mergers and summer homes, the occasional burst of laughter from the private dining section. In her previous life, before David died in what the FBI officially classified as a compromised operation, she'd been an intelligence analyst specializing in organized crime networks. She'd learned that criminal behavior followed predictable patterns, that fear had a distinct signature in body language, that people planning violence moved with a different rhythm than people planning celebrations. The family at Table 7 was breaking every pattern she'd ever studied. She continued her work with mechanical precision, her eyes tracking the breakfast scene through the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the morning light. To the hostess, to the manager, to the well-dressed diners discussing their Sunday plans over mimosas and Belgian waffles, she was just another server. Polite, efficient, forgettable. Invisible. That invisibility had kept her alive for 3 years while she did something dangerous and probably insane. She'd been hunting the people who murdered her fiancé. David Kim had been working undercover for the FBI, infiltrating the Choi Syndicate, a brutal Korean organized crime network operating across the Pacific Northwest. 6 weeks after he told Selin he was getting close to something big, something that would bring the entire organization down, his body was found in an abandoned warehouse in Tacoma with 2 bullets in his chest. The FBI called it a tragedy, closed the case within months, and moved on. But Selin hadn't moved on. She'd looked. She'd learned. She'd taken every classified file David had shared with her in confidence and spent 3 years building an intelligence map of the organization that had taken everything from her. And tonight, she was watching something unfold that made her pulse spike with recognition. The family had arrived at 9:15. An older couple in their late 50s, a younger woman with elegant features and a serene smile, and a man whose presence commanded the room even while seated. Selin had been refilling coffee at table 4 when she got close enough to hear names. James and Catherine, their daughter Min-ji, and her husband Kelly. Kelly Churchill. Everyone who worked in Seattle's upscale dining circuit had heard whispers about that name, though most people had the survival instinct not to acknowledge what they knew. Korean American. Connected. Dangerous. The kind of man who tipped 40% and never raised his voice, and whose reservation requests were never, ever declined. But that wasn't what made Selin's hand tighten on the coffee pot. It was James and Catherine Lee. Those names detonated in her memory like a flashbang. She knew those names. They were written in David's handwriting in the encrypted files she'd memorized, studied, and cross-referenced for 3 years. High-value targets. Choi Syndicate accountants. Embezzled $2.3 million. Fled into witness protection March 2022. And underneath, in David's careful notes, extremely dangerous if cornered. Will sacrifice anyone to survive. Do not trust under any circumstances. Selin's training kicked in automatically, her face remaining neutral even as her mind shifted into threat assessment mode. She set down the coffee pot and began the careful work of reading the room. Table 7. The picture of family harmony. Champagne flutes catching morning light. Laughter that sounded just slightly too loud. Catherine Lee touching her daughter's hand with trembling fingers. James checking his watch every 45 seconds with mechanical precision. Table 10. A man sitting alone, barely touching his green tea. Dead eyes. Scar tissue along his jawline. The stillness of a predator waiting. Yoon Park. The ghost. The Choi Syndicate's most lethal enforcer. Kitchen entrance. 2 men in casual clothes, positioned where staff should be but weren't. The subtle bulge under their jackets that spoke of concealed weapons. Emergency exit. 1 more operative, pretending to check his phone, blocking the only other way out. The horrible truth assembled itself in Selin's mind with sickening clarity. This wasn't a family breakfast. This was an execution. The Lees had been found. And they'd made a deal, the only deal desperate people make when cornered by the monsters they betrayed. They'd brought their daughter and son-in-law to breakfast like lambs to slaughter, keeping them in the kill zone until the clock ran down. Sellen's heart hammered against her ribs as she calculated the timeline. The way Catherine kept glancing toward the kitchen. The way James's forced smile never reached his eyes. The way both parents kept touching Minji like they were memorizing her, saying goodbye. And Kelly Churchill, powerful, protected, untouchable Kelly Churchill, had no idea he was sitting at the center of a carefully orchestrated trap, about to be erased along with his wife while her parents walked away with their debts forgiven and their lives intact. Sellen stood frozen behind the host stand, 3 years of invisible hunting colliding with this single moment of impossible choice. She could stay invisible, stay safe, let the scene play out the way the Lees and the Choi Syndicate had planned it. Continue her patient, careful hunt for justice. Or she could do what nobody had done for David when his cover was blown and his time ran out. She could warn them. The memory hit her like a physical blow. David's last text message, sent at 2:47 a.m. the night he died. If something happens to me, remember. The job is protecting people, not hunting bad guys. Promise me you'll remember the difference. Sellen grabbed a water pitcher with hands that appeared steady to any observer, even though her entire body was vibrating with adrenaline. 3 years of invisibility, about to be sacrificed for 2 strangers. But Minji Churchill wasn't a stranger, she was every innocent person who ever got caught in the crossfire of someone else's debts, someone else's violence, someone else's survival instinct. Sellen approached table 7, her face a mask of professional courtesy. And everything changed. Sellen lifted the crystal water pitcher from the service station, her reflection fragmenting across its polished surface. Sunday morning at the garden terrace always had a particular quality, softer, more intimate than the power lunches and business dinners that filled the weekday hours. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the white tablecloths gold and casting long shadows across the Brazilian cherry floors. Table 7 sat in the prime position near the windows, where the view stretched across Elliott Bay toward the Olympic Mountains. The family gathered there looked like something from a luxury lifestyle magazine. The kind of image that would caption perfectly, celebrating family, celebrating life. Sellen knew better. She approached with the smooth, unhurried pace of a server who'd learned to be present without being noticed. The man at the head of the table commanded attention even while seated, late 30s, sharp features that spoke of Korean heritage, with intricate tattoos visible above the collar of his crisp white shirt. The ink curved up his neck in patterns that suggested dragons or serpents, bold enough to be seen, expensive enough to be art. His watch caught the light as he reached for his champagne flute. Patek Philippe, probably worth more than Sellen had made in the past 3 years combined. Kelly Churchill. The name whispered itself through her memory. Beside him sat a woman whose elegance seemed effortless, dark hair swept into a chignon, a designer dress in dove gray that probably cost what most people paid for rent, and a smile that reached her eyes when she looked at her husband. Minji Churchill. The warmth between them was genuine, palpable. Whatever else Kelly Churchill was, he loved his wife. Across from them sat the older couple, and that's where Sellen's trained eye caught the fractures in the perfect scene. Dr. James Lee wore a suit that fit well but hung slightly wrong on his frame, as if he'd lost weight recently. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his smile broad, but his eyes kept darting toward the kitchen entrance with mechanical frequency. Every 45 seconds, Sellen had counted. Catherine Lee wore pearls and a cream silk blouse, her manicured hands gesturing as she spoke, but those same hands trembled slightly when they lifted her mimosa glass. She kept touching her daughter's arm, her shoulder, her hand, small, fleeting contacts that looked affectionate but felt desperate. More water for the table? Sellen asked, her voice pitched at the perfect level of professional courtesy. Present but not intrusive. Yes, thank you, Minji said, her smile genuine and kind. The smile of someone who'd never learned to treat service workers as invisible. Sellen moved around the table, refilling glasses with practiced precision. That's when she heard Dr. Lee's voice, pitched low for his daughter's ears but not quite low enough. James, you're being paranoid, Catherine said with forced lightness. Everything's fine. Just enjoy the morning. Dr. James Lee. The name landed like a blade between Sellen's ribs. Her hand remained steady on the pitcher even as her mind flashed back 3 years. Late nights in her apartment, David's encrypted laptop open on her kitchen table, coffee gone cold as she studied faces and names and connections. The files David had shared with her before the FBI classified them, before they disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. The Lee's photographs stared back at her from memory with perfect clarity. Younger then, but unmistakable. The FBI profile summary written in clinical federal prose, high-value targets. Choi syndicate accountants. Embezzled $2.3 million through elaborate shell company scheme. Fled into witness protection March 2022. Cooperation level, minimal. Flight risk, extreme. Extremely dangerous if cornered. But it was David's handwritten note in the margin that burned brightest in Sellen's memory, his familiar scrawl in blue ink. They'll sacrifice anyone to survive. Do not trust under any circumstances. These people have no bottom. Sellen finished refilling the water glasses, her face a mask of professional neutrality even as cold recognition flooded her system. The Lees weren't just dangerous criminals who'd betrayed a syndicate and stolen millions. They were sitting across from their own daughter, smiling and raising champagne glasses, while something terrible waited in the wings. And Minji Churchill, elegant, kind Minji who smiled at waitresses, had no idea her parents had already sold her life to buy their own. Sellen returned the water pitcher to the service station with movements that had become muscle memory. She straightened the linen napkins in their brass holder, aligned the salt and pepper shakers, her hands performing their routine tasks while her mind shifted into the analytical mode David had taught her during their late-night conversations about threat assessment. Start with the anomaly, then work outward in concentric circles. The anomaly was the Lees. Everything else would radiate from that center point. She pulled out her phone, pretending to check a reservation request, while her eyes swept the restaurant with systematic precision. 23 occupied tables, 41 guests, 4 servers including herself, 2 managers, 1 hostess, kitchen staff behind the double doors, and the threats. Table 10 sat in the corner, positioned with perfect tactical advantage. A man dining alone, which wasn't unusual for a Sunday morning. What was unusual was the way he sat, absolutely still, with the kind of stillness that only came from professional discipline. His green tea had been delivered 15 minutes ago and remained untouched except for one performative sip. His eyes, when they lifted from his phone, were flat and dead as a shark's. Sellen knew that face. Yoon Park. They called him the ghost in the intelligence files David had shown her, though never to his face. The Choi syndicate's primary enforcer. Body count estimated between 15 and 30, though nothing had ever been proven. He had a scar along his jawline that suggested someone had once come close to killing him, and the kind of predatory patience that meant he'd killed them instead. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was watching table 7 in the window's reflection. Her gaze shifted to the kitchen entrance. 2 men stood near the double doors, both wearing casual button-downs and dark jeans. They'd been there since the restaurant opened at 9, positioned like customers waiting for a table, except the hostess had offered them seating twice and they declined both times. The bulge under the taller one's jacket was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, a concealed weapon worn at the 4 o'clock position. The shorter man had his jacket draped over his left arm despite the warmth of the restaurant, the fabric weighted wrong. Neither man was watching the hostess stand or looking impatient. They were watching the exits. Sellen's pulse accelerated even as her face remained neutral. She moved to adjust a flower arrangement near the emergency exit, her trained eye catching the third operative immediately. Mid-30s, athletic build, pretending to check his phone while positioned directly in front of the door marked exit in glowing red letters. His stance was casual, but his shoulder blocked the push bar. Nobody was leaving through that door without going through him first. 4 professional operatives. Coordinated positioning. Clear sight lines to table 7. This wasn't paranoia. This was a kill box. Sellen risked another glance at table 7, and the final pieces assembled themselves with devastating clarity. Catherine Lee's hand trembled as she raised her mimosa glass to her lips, the champagne sloshing slightly. She set it down and immediately reached out to touch Minji's shoulder, her fingers lingering there with the pressure of someone memorizing the feeling. James checked his watch again. Sellen counted, 28 seconds since the last time. His smile remained fixed, but sweat had begun to bead at his hairline despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. Both parents kept touching their daughter. Small gestures that looked affectionate from a distance but felt wrong up close. The way Catherine smoothed Min Ji's hair. The way James squeezed his daughter's hand and held on just a moment too long. The way they both looked at her like they were trying to memorize her face. They were saying goodbye. The truth hit Selin like ice water. The Lees hadn't just been found by the Choi Syndicate. They'd made a deal. The only deal that desperate, cornered people ever make with monsters who want them dead. They'd traded something more valuable than their own lives. They'd traded their daughter. This wasn't an execution of the accountants who'd stolen $2.3 million and embarrassed the organization. That would be business, quick, efficient, done in private. This was a message. This was theater. Force parents to sacrifice their own child as the ultimate demonstration of what happens when you betray the Choi Syndicate. Make it public enough that the story spreads. Make it brutal enough that nobody ever forgets. Kelly Churchill was probably just collateral damage, a bonus target. But Min Ji, kind, elegant Min Ji who smiled at waitresses, she was the lesson. The ultimate price her parents would pay for their theft and betrayal, more devastating than any bullet. And the breakfast would continue with forced champagne toasts and nervous laughter until whatever deadline the Lees had been given finally ran out. Selin stood frozen behind the service station, her hands gripping the edge of the polished wood hard enough that her knuckles went white. 3 years. 3 years of careful invisibility, of patient intelligence gathering, of building the case that would eventually destroy the Choi Syndicate from the inside out. 3 years of survival predicated on one absolute rule: never break cover. If she walked away right now, if she let this play out the way the Lees and Young Park had orchestrated it, her cover remained intact. She could continue her hunt. She could finish what David started. She could bring down the entire organization with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 1,000 sleepless nights mapping every connection, every operation, every weakness. All it would cost was 2 lives she didn't know and had no obligation to save. The job is protecting people, not hunting bad guys. David's voice echoed through her memory with such clarity it felt like he was standing beside her. That's what he'd said the night he proposed, sitting on the floor of her apartment with takeout containers scattered around them and his grandmother's ring in a velvet box. She'd asked him how he could do what he did, how he could walk into danger every day knowing the system was broken, knowing the bad guys often won, knowing that justice was a luxury most people never got. The job is protecting people, not hunting bad guys. If I start thinking about it as revenge or punishment, I become what they are. But if I can save even one person who didn't deserve what was coming for them, then I've done something that matters. Selin's eyes burned. She could see him so clearly, his crooked smile when he was trying to be profound, the way his hair stuck up in the back when he'd been running his hands through it while studying case files, the laugh that always surprised her because it didn't match his serious face. The last text he'd sent her had come at 2:47 a.m. She'd memorized every word. If something happens to me, remember, the job is protecting people, not hunting bad guys. Promise me you'll remember the difference. I love you, always. Nobody had warned David when his cover was compromised. Nobody had slipped him a note or whispered a warning that Victor Choi's nephew had recognized him from a federal courthouse photograph. Nobody had given him the chance to run. He'd walked into that warehouse meeting thinking he was gathering evidence, and he'd died on a concrete floor surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be eliminated. But Min Ji Churchill wasn't David. Min Ji was a woman having breakfast with her husband, probably thinking about what they'd do with the rest of their Sunday, completely unaware that her parents had already signed her death warrant in exchange for 30 more days of their own survival. Min Ji was innocent. And if Selin walked away, if she chose her carefully constructed hunt over this woman's life, then she became everything she hated about the system that had failed David. She became the person who had the information, had the chance to act, and chose bureaucracy and strategy over a human life. She became complicit. The decision crystallized with sudden, absolute clarity. Selin grabbed a water pitcher and a linen napkin from the service station. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, folding the napkin and pulling a pen from her apron. She drew a crude map in quick, economical strokes: service corridor, left turn, gray door, back parking lot. She wrote in tight block letters: service corridor. Turn left. Gray door. My car. Back parking. Then she walked toward table 7, her heartbeat thundering in her ears even as her face remained professionally pleasant. 3 years of invisibility, about to evaporate in the next 60 seconds. 3 years of patient hunting, about to be sacrificed for 2 strangers. But they weren't really strangers anymore, were they? Min-ji had smiled at her. Had said thank you with genuine kindness. Had treated her like a person instead of furniture. That was enough. Selin approached the table, pitcher in hand, and leaned close to Kelly Churchill as she refilled his water glass. Close enough that her lips were inches from his ear. Close enough that nobody else at the table could hear her voice, pitched barely above a whisper. Don't react. Your in-laws sold you out. Armed men at table 10, kitchen doors, and emergency exit. You have maybe 3 minutes. Run now. She felt him go absolutely still, every muscle tensing with the instant recognition of someone who'd lived with danger before. She slid the folded napkin underneath his coffee saucer, her movements smooth and practiced, then straightened and moved to refill Min-ji's glass as if nothing had happened. Kelly Churchill's eyes flickered once toward table 10, once toward the kitchen doors. Then he smiled at his wife with perfect, practiced calm, and Selin knew he understood exactly what was coming. Kelly Churchill's eyes moved with the precision of someone reading a tactical situation in real time. One glance toward table 10. One toward the kitchen doors. One toward the emergency exit. The entire assessment took less than 3 seconds, and Selin watched his expression shift from casual Sunday breakfast to something cold and deadly. Navy SEAL. The intelligence files had mentioned it, Kelly Churchill's military service before he'd transitioned into the murky world where organized crime met private security met something the federal government couldn't quite classify. He recognized a kill box when he was sitting in one. He set down his champagne flute with deliberate care, his hand moving to rest casually near his hip where Selin now understood he carried concealed. His smile never wavered as he looked at Min-ji. Sorry, hun. Emergency call. We need to go. He stood smoothly, his hand closing around Min-ji's elbow with gentle but unmistakable firmness, pulling her up from her chair. What? Kelly, we haven't even. Min-ji's confused smile faltered as she read something in her husband's face that made her stop talking. Dr. James Lee's mask shattered. Kelly, wait. His hand shot out, grabbing Kelly's forearm with desperate strength. You can't leave. Not yet. Just sit down, please, just a few more minutes. At table 10, Yoon Park rose from his chair with fluid, economical grace. The 2 operatives near the kitchen doors moved into position, their casual stance evaporating into purposeful motion. Kelly's voice dropped to a register that made the temperature around table 7 plummet. His eyes locked on Dr. Lee's face with absolute, lethal focus. Let go of my wife. The restaurant seemed to pause, trapped in that crystalline moment before violence erupts. Selin could see it unfolding with horrible clarity, Yoon Park's hand moving toward his jacket, the kitchen operatives closing distance, Catherine Lee's face collapsing into devastation and guilt. 9:47 a.m. Yoon Park's hand emerged from his jacket with a matte black pistol, the suppressor already attached. The kitchen doors burst open and the 2 operatives came through with weapons drawn, professional and coordinated. The emergency exit man moved to block the only other escape route, his own gun appearing in his hand. Kelly moved on pure instinct. His hand released Min-ji and grabbed the edge of the breakfast table, flipping it forward with explosive force. The table crashed down between them and Yoon Park, champagne glasses shattering into crystal rain, plates and silverware clattering across the hardwood floor. Min-ji screamed. Other diners scrambled away from their tables, their Sunday morning erupting into chaos. The first suppressed shots came like harsh coughs, bullets punching through the overturned table and the upholstered chairs. Kelly had already drawn his own weapon, compact, professional, and returned fire over the makeshift barricade. His shots were measured, controlled, designed to suppress rather than kill. One toward Yoon Park, one toward each kitchen operative. Buying seconds, not trying to win a gunfight against 4 professionals. Service corridor. Now. Selin's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. She was already moving, gesturing frantically toward the kitchen. Follow me. Kelly grabbed Min-ji, shielding her body with his own as they ran in a crouched sprint. Dr. and Mrs. Lee remained frozen at the table, their betrayal complete, their daughter running for her life from the death they'd arranged. Selin burst through the kitchen doors ahead of them, her server's knowledge of the restaurant layout transformed into tactical advantage. The kitchen staff had already scattered, professional survival instincts sending them diving behind stainless steel counters. She led Kelly and Min-ji through the maze of prep stations and industrial ovens, past the walk-in freezer, toward the back service area. The gray door marked, "Authorized personnel only," stood exactly where she'd drawn it on the napkin. Selin slammed it open, and they emerged into the back parking lot where delivery trucks usually unloaded produce and meat. The morning sun was painfully bright after the restaurant's interior, the mundane normalcy of a Seattle Sunday shocking against the violence they'd just fled. Selin's 10-year-old Honda Civic sat running at the far end of the lot, exactly where she'd positioned it during her opening shift. The engine's loyal rumble had never sounded so beautiful. "Get in." She sprinted for the driver's side while Kelly shoved Min-ji into the back seat and dove in after her, his body still covering hers, his gun still drawn and ready. Selin threw the car into drive before Kelly's door was fully closed. The tires shrieked against asphalt as she accelerated toward the parking lot exit, putting distance between them and the garden terrace. Behind them, through the restaurant's back door, Yoon Park emerged into the sunlight, his weapon raised and tracking. But they were already moving, already gone, already surviving against odds that had been carefully calculated to ensure they wouldn't. Selin drove with the controlled aggression of someone who'd spent years studying evasive driving techniques in theory and was now executing them in terrifying practice. She took surface streets instead of highways, varied her speed, checked her mirrors with mechanical frequency. The Honda's old engine protested the hard acceleration, but it held together. In the back seat, Kelly kept his weapon drawn and his eyes on the rear window, tracking every car that appeared behind them. Min-ji sat pressed against him, her elegant dove gray dress stained with champagne and scattered with tiny cuts from flying glass. She was shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps that suggested shock settling in. "Stay with me, hun," Kelly said quietly, his free hand gripping hers. "You're okay. We're okay." They didn't move, Min-ji whispered, her voice hollow. "My parents. They just sat there. They didn't run. They didn't even flinch when the guns," her voice broke. Kelly's expression remained neutral, but Selin caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. There was something in his gaze that went beyond anger into a territory that was colder and more dangerous. "Where are we going?" Selin asked, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Kelly rattled off an address in Redmond. 20 minutes if traffic cooperates. "Can you get us there without being followed?" Yes, she could. She did. 19 minutes later, the Honda pulled up to a nondescript luxury home in one of Redmond's quiet residential neighborhoods. It looked like every other renovated craftsman on the street: landscaped yard, two-car garage, the kind of house that suggested successful tech industry money but nothing excessive. Except for the cameras. Selin's trained eye caught them immediately, discreet but comprehensive. And the way the garage door opened before they'd fully stopped, controlled from inside. And the two men who appeared from the house's side entrance before Kelly had even opened his car door, their movements professional and alert. "Clear," Kelly said as he emerged, keeping Min-ji behind him. "But we had a hit team at the garden terrace. 4 operators minimum." Yoon Park was running point. The taller of the two men, late 40s, military bearing, shoulder holster visible under his jacket, went pale. "The ghost? Sir, we need to move you to the secondary location." "Not yet, Marcus. Secure the perimeter. Full protocol. Nobody in or out without my authorization." Kelly's voice carried absolute authority, the kind that came from years of command. "And get a trauma specialist here for Min-ji. Now." Marcus and the other security operative moved with immediate efficiency. Within minutes, 4 additional men had materialized from positions around the property, creating overlapping fields of observation. The house's windows dimmed as smart glass activated, turning them opaque from the outside. Kelly guided Min-ji inside, through a marble foyer and into a living room that managed to be both luxurious and fortress-like. Thick walls, minimal windows, furniture positioned to provide cover if necessary. Min-ji sank onto a leather sofa, still shaking, her mind clearly trying to process what her parents had done. My parents, she repeated, looking up at Kelly with devastated eyes. They were right there. They didn't move. They knew, didn't they? They knew what was going to happen. Kelly's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. Yes, they knew. Then he turned to face Selin, and the gentleness evaporated. His eyes assessed her with the same tactical precision he'd used to read the kill box at the restaurant. Who are you? And don't tell me you're just a waitress. You read that setup before I did. You had an escape route planned. You knew Yung Park by sight. His voice dropped to something harder. FBI? Dia? Because you're too good at reading a kill team to be just a waitress. Selin met his gaze directly, 3 years of careful lies finally ending. Former FBI intelligence analyst. Organized crime division. I resigned 3 years ago after my fiancé was killed. She paused, then delivered the truth that connected everything. David Kim. Undercover agent. He was closing in on the Choi Syndicate when his cover was blown. Your wife's parents gave them the information that got him killed. Kelly's expression shifted, understanding crystallizing. So this wasn't random. You've been hunting them. For 3 years. I've been working service jobs, staying invisible, building an intelligence map of the Choi Syndicate's entire operation. Your in-laws' names were in David's files. High-value targets. Embezzlers. Extremely dangerous if cornered. Selin's voice remained clinical, professional, even as the old grief threatened to surface. When I recognized them this morning, I knew what was happening. The Lees got found. They made a deal. And your wife was the price. Kelly was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through implications and possibilities. Then his tactical assessment shifted into something that looked almost like respect. Then you know what we're dealing with. You know their structure, their personnel, their operations. Yes. And you have information I need. It wasn't a question. Selin nodded slowly. I have 3 years of intelligence. Everything David gathered before he died, and everything I've documented since. Names, locations, financial networks, operational patterns. Everything. Kelly's expression hardened into something cold and purposeful. Good. Because they just declared war. And I intend to finish it. Marcus returned 30 minutes later with a young woman carrying a medical bag and a man in his 20s who looked like he belonged in a Silicon Valley startup rather than a fortified safe house. The medic went immediately to Min-ji, speaking in low, soothing tones as she checked for injuries and signs of shock. The young man, rail-thin, with expensive sneakers and 3 laptops in a messenger bag, set up at Kelly's dining table without needing to be told. This is Owen, Kelly said to Selin. Best tech specialist in the Pacific Northwest. Possibly the country. Owen's fingers were already flying across his keyboard, multiple screens blooming to life. I need 45 minutes. Maybe less if their operational security is as sloppy as most of these organizations. It took 32 minutes. The evidence unfolded across 3 monitors arranged on Kelly's dining table like a triptych of betrayal. Selin stood beside Kelly, watching the documentation of a deal that had traded Min-ji's life for her parents' survival. Her professional detachment, the analytical distance she'd maintained for 3 years, cracked as the full scope of the Lee's calculation became visible. The first video was timestamped 4 days ago. Parking garage, level 3, corner section where cameras had poor coverage. A black Mercedes with tinted windows. Yung Park in the driver's seat, his scarred face visible through the windshield. Dr. James Lee and Catherine Lee in the back seat, their body language radiating desperation. Money changed hands. Cash in a manila envelope, probably a down payment on their betrayal. Catherine Lee was crying. James Lee's face was blank, already resigned to what they'd agreed to do. There, Selin said, pointing at the screen. Freeze that frame. Catherine's holding something. Owen zoomed in. A photograph. Min-ji's face, smiling, taken from what looked like social media. Target confirmation, Kelly said quietly, his voice like ice over steel. They brought her picture to identify their own daughter. The second video was timestamped 2 days ago. Same parking garage, different location. Yung Park had spread photographs across the Mercedes hood, exterior shots of the garden terrace, interior layouts, table arrangements. He was pointing at Table 7's location, demonstrating sightlines and exit routes. Catherine Lee had her hand over her mouth, her whole body shaking. James Lee was nodding, committing the details to memory. The operational briefing for their daughter's execution. The third video was from yesterday. Afternoon sunlight instead of parking garage shadows, a park bench near Green Lake. Young Park handed the Lees a document. They read it, signed it, handed it back. Young Park's smile was the coldest thing Selin had ever seen, not cruel or sadistic, just absolutely empty of anything human. The smile of someone completing a transaction. Got the burner phone records, Owen said, his voice tight with anger despite his professional composure. Young Park to a number registered to James Lee. Sent this morning at 8:47 a.m. The text message appeared on the center screen, and Min-ji made a sound like something breaking inside her chest. Keep them at table until 9:47 a.m. No early departures, no bathroom breaks. Your debt dies with her. Your lives continue. The medic wrapped a protective arm around Min-ji's shoulders, but there was no comfort that could reach through the devastation of those words. Your debt dies with her. Not with you. With her. Selin's analytical training pushed through her own grief and anger, assembling the larger picture. They didn't just betray you for money, she said, her voice steady even as Min-ji wept silently. This was their witness protection deal falling apart. The Choi Syndicate found them. I don't know how, but they found them. And once you're found, you're already dead. There's no negotiating, no second chance. Kelly's hands were gripped so tightly on the edge of the table that his knuckles had gone white. So they bought themselves more time. Not just time. They bought survival. Complete debt forgiveness, probably new identities, money to disappear again. Selin's voice was clinical, but her eyes reflected the horror of what she was describing. The Choi Syndicate found the one thing more valuable to the Lees than their own lives, and they made them trade it. Your wife wasn't business. She was a message. She was theater. They were dead either way, Kelly said slowly, working through the brutal logic. So they traded their daughter's life for one more day of their own. Min-ji's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, broken and hollow. They chose themselves, over me. She looked up at Kelly, and the devastation in her eyes was absolute. Not just the terror of nearly dying, but the far worse realization that her parents, the people who'd raised her, who'd held her as a child, who'd celebrated every milestone, had calculated her death as an acceptable price for their own survival. They sat across from me, Min-ji continued, tears streaming down her face. They smiled. They raised their champagne glasses. They touched my hand. Her voice broke completely. They said goodbye. And I didn't even know. Marcus returned 2 hours later with a text message for Kelly, package secured. Hotel room, no resistance. Bringing them in. Min-ji had been sitting in silence since the videos ended, wrapped in a blanket despite the house's comfortable temperature, staring at nothing. When Kelly told her that her parents were being brought to the safe house, something shifted in her expression, the shock crystallizing into something harder and more terrible. I want to see them, she said quietly. I want to hear them say it. Kelly hesitated. Min-ji, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Her voice was steady now, the kind of steadiness that came after everything breakable had already shattered. I need to hear them explain how they did it. How they smiled at me while they were counting down the minutes until I died. The basement room was windowless and soundproofed, designed for exactly this kind of confrontation. Marcus had installed Dr. James and Catherine Lee in 2 chairs bolted to the concrete floor, their hands zip-tied in front of them. They looked smaller than they had at breakfast, diminished by fear and guilt and the knowledge of what they'd done. Catherine Lee started crying the moment Min-ji walked through the door. Sweetheart, thank God you're safe. We were so worried. Stop. Min-ji's voice cut through her mother's words like a blade. Just stop. Marcus pulled up the videos on a wall-mounted screen without needing to be asked. All 3 meetings played in sequence, the money exchange, the operational briefing, the contract signing. Then the text message, displayed in letters large enough to be read from across the room. Keep them at table until 9:47 a.m. Your debt dies with her. Your lives continue. Catherine Lee's face collapsed into raw anguish. We thought it was Kelly they wanted. We thought you'd be safe. They promised us that if we just got you there, if we kept you at the table, they'd only go after Kelly and you'd walk away. They promised. Selen's fury detonated. She stepped forward, her voice shaking with 3 years of grief and rage finally finding a target. You're lying. To yourself and to her. You had 100 choices. You could have told the truth. You could have warned them the moment Young Park contacted you. You could have called the FBI, disappeared again, run somewhere else, done literally anything except smile and make toasts while you served your daughter to executioners like she was the breakfast special. You don't understand, Catherine sobbed. We had 3 days. 3 days to decide. They found us. After 2 years of hiding, of looking over our shoulders, they found us. We were out of options. You had options, Selen said coldly. You chose the one that kept you alive at your daughter's expense. Don't pretend this was anything else. You knew exactly what you were doing. Dr. James Lee had been silent until now, his face ashen, his hands trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. We were out of time. If we refused, they would have killed us all. At least this way, Min-ji had a chance. No. Kelly's voice was deadly quiet, more terrifying than any shout. He stood beside Min-ji, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the man who'd tried to have his wife murdered. They would have killed you. Just you. That's what happens when you steal from the Choi Syndicate and embarrass them. You die. That would have been justice. Fair payment for what you did. But you chose differently, Selen continued, her voice razor sharp. You chose to trade your daughter's life, innocent, uninvolved in any of your crimes, for 30 more days of your own. You calculated that her death was worth your survival. And then you sat across from her and pretended to celebrate while you watched the clock count down. Catherine Lee was shaking so hard the chair rattled. We're her parents. We gave her life. And then you tried to take it back. Min-ji's voice was quiet but carried across the room with absolute clarity. She stepped forward, looking at her parents with eyes that held no recognition, no connection, nothing but devastation and finality. You gave me life 32 years ago. And this morning, you signed the contract for my death. Those two things don't cancel out. They just show me exactly who you are when survival is on the line. Min-ji, please. James Lee reached toward his daughter with his zip-tied hands. Don't. Min-ji's voice was ice. She turned to Kelly, her decision already made. I want them alive, not forgiven, not in my life, but alive, because I won't become what they are. I won't decide that their deaths would make this better. She paused, her voice breaking slightly before steadying again. But I never want to see them again. Put them somewhere safe and far away. Give them whatever money they need to survive. And then they stop existing to me. Kelly nodded slowly, understanding the devastating grace of what she was choosing. Montana. Secure facility. Full support. Complete isolation. They'll be protected, but they'll live with what they did. Min-ji looked at her parents one last time. You traded me for your lives. I'm trading your presence for my peace. We're done. She turned and walked out of the room without looking back. The war room took shape in Kelly's basement over the next 6 hours. Selen spread 3 years of intelligence across a conference table that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a fortified safe house. David's original files, printed and annotated. Her own documentation, surveillance photographs, financial records, organizational charts mapping every level of the Choi Syndicate's hierarchy. Names, addresses, operational patterns, supply chains, protection payments, everything. Kelly studied the material with the focused intensity of someone who'd planned military operations in far more hostile environments. Marcus stood beside him, along with 2 other men Selen recognized as former military by their bearing alone. Owen was already cross-referencing her intelligence with real-time data, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards. This is comprehensive, Kelly said finally, looking at Selen with something that might have been respect. 3 years of professional-grade intelligence work. The FBI would pay 7 figures for this. The FBI had their chance, Selen said flatly. They closed David's case and moved on. I didn't. Kelly nodded slowly, understanding the hunger for justice that had driven her invisible hunt. Then let's finish what he started. Your intelligence. My resources. 96 hours to dismantle an organization that's been operating for 20 years. They tried to kill your wife, Selen said. They murdered my fiancé. And they've hurt hundreds of people who never had the chance to fight back. I want them gone. Completely. Then we're in agreement. Kelly's smile was cold and purposeful. Let's go to war. Hour 0 to 24. Sullen's intelligence identified the Choice Syndicate's financial hub, a seemingly legitimate import-export business operating out of Tacoma's industrial district. The business handled container shipping from South Korea and served as the primary mechanism for laundering drug money and moving illegal funds offshore. Kelly made 3 phone calls to contacts he'd cultivated over years of strategic cooperation with federal law enforcement, the kind of cooperation that bought goodwill and immunity in exchange for information about bigger fish. At 4:17 a.m., IRS agents and FBI financial crimes specialists executed simultaneous raids on the Tacoma facility and 3 associated addresses. They found $4.7 million in cash, sophisticated money laundering software, and Alexei Choi, the syndicate's chief accountant, attempting to destroy hard drives in a second-floor office. By sunrise, the Choi Syndicate's financial infrastructure was in federal custody, and every bank account Sullen had identified was frozen. Hour 24 to 48. With their money disappearing and their accountant arrested, the Choi Syndicate's drug operations became vulnerable. Sullen had mapped 3 primary distribution networks, one in South Seattle, one in Tacoma, one in Everett. Kelly's intelligence, combined with her documentation, gave federal DEA teams everything they needed for coordinated strikes. 7 mid-level operators were arrested in raids that happened within a 40-minute window, carefully timed to prevent warnings from spreading through the network. Street-level dealers scattered when their supply chain evaporated. The drug operations that had generated millions in annual revenue collapsed in less than 2 days. Hour 48 to 72. Young Park was the keystone. Without him, the Choi Syndicate lost its enforcement capability, its primary weapon for maintaining control through fear. Sullen had documented his known associates, his safe houses, his patterns of movement. Kelly's team worked systematically, isolating each associate, applying pressure, tracking Young's increasingly desperate attempts to disappear. Owen found him through cell tower triangulation and cross-referenced security footage. A safe house in Everett, residential neighborhood, second-floor apartment. Young Park was alone, his network dissolved, his protection gone. Hour 72 to 96. Kelly's team breached the apartment at 3 a.m. with professional precision. Young Park fought. He was a professional who'd survived 20 years in a lethal business, but 5 against 1 wasn't a fight, it was an inevitability. Within 90 seconds, he was on his knees in his own living room, zip-tied and bleeding from a split lip, his legendary reputation reduced to the reality of capture. Sullen had waited outside until Marcus gave the all-clear. Now she walked into the apartment, her heart hammering but her hands steady. Young Park looked up at her with those dead, shark eyes, not recognizing her at first. Just another face. Another person he'd never bothered to see as human. She knelt down close to him, close enough that her whisper would be heard only by him. "That's for David Kim. And for every person you've hurt." Recognition flickered in Young's eyes then, a memory of an undercover agent 3 years ago, and the woman who'd loved him. David's fiancée. The analyst who was supposed to be broken and irrelevant, destroyed by grief and powerless to retaliate. Young said, his voice rough with blood and surprise. "Me," Sullen confirmed. Then she stood and walked away, leaving him to Kelly's justice and federal custody. 3-week aftermath. The Choi Syndicate's infrastructure collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. Without money, without drugs, without enforcement, the organization that had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades simply disintegrated. Leadership fled to South Korea. Mid-level operators turned informant or disappeared. Street-level workers abandoned the business entirely. The vacuum was filled by federal prosecutions, asset seizures, and the quiet satisfaction of people who'd lived in fear finally breathing freely. David's unfinished mission was complete. The offer came 4 days after Young Park was transferred to federal custody and the last remnants of the Choi Syndicate scattered like smoke. Sullen was sitting in Kelly's office, a space that managed to be both elegant and functional, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Redmond's tree-lined streets and security monitors discreetly embedded in the mahogany paneling. Kelly set down a folder containing what looked like employment contracts. Director of Intelligence. You see things nobody else sees. You saw the trap at breakfast before anyone fired a shot. That's the difference between surviving and winning." He paused, his expression serious. "Name your terms." Selin had spent 3 years invisible, 3 years hunting alone, 3 years convinced that her purpose began and ended with revenge. Now she was being offered something she hadn't allowed herself to imagine, a future. A purpose beyond destruction. "Complete operational autonomy," she said, her voice steady. "If I see danger, internal or external, I tell you everything. No politics, no protecting feelings, no filters. I assess threats honestly, and I report them honestly. And I get to decide when something violates the lines I won't cross." Kelly didn't hesitate. "Deal. Because if you'd stayed invisible, Min-ji and I would be dead. Your judgment saved our lives when you had every reason to let us die and continue your hunt alone. I trust that judgment." He extended his hand across the desk. "Welcome to the team." Selin shook his hand, feeling the weight of the decision settle into something that felt almost like relief. Later that afternoon, she found Min-ji in the safe house garden, a beautifully landscaped space behind the fortified walls, where cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom. Min-ji sat on a stone bench, her face turned toward the sun, looking more peaceful than she had since the morning at the garden terrace. "I wanted to thank you," Min-ji said as Selin approached. "For seeing me when I was invisible to my own parents. For valuing my life when they didn't." Her voice was quiet but steady, the devastating grief beginning to transform into something she could survive. "You didn't know me. You had no reason to risk everything you'd built. But you did anyway. You smiled at me," Selin said simply. "You said thank you like you meant it. You saw me as a person. That was enough." Min-ji's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I'd like us to be friends. If that's something you'd want." Selin felt something crack open in her chest, a space that had been sealed shut for 3 years, protected by grief and anger and the singular focus of her hunt. "I'd like that." They sat together in comfortable silence, two women who'd survived impossible betrayals, beginning to build something new from the wreckage. The Lees were relocated to a secure facility in Montana within the week. Marcus handled the arrangements personally, a comfortable apartment, financial support sufficient for their needs, 24-hour security to ensure they stayed alive. And absolute isolation from their daughter. They would live with their choice forever, protected but alone, surviving but never forgiven. 4 weeks later, Kelly and Min-ji sat at their own dining table having breakfast, secure, private, protected. Morning light streamed through windows that were bulletproof but looked like ordinary glass. Coffee and fresh fruit and the quiet comfort of Sunday morning without the shadow of violence. Selin's text arrived at 9:15 a.m., all clear. Perimeter secure. No threats detected. Kelly showed the message to Min-ji, and something passed between them that was part gratitude, part grief, part hope. "David Kim was a good man," Kelly said quietly. "He trained her well, and she chose to save us when she could have let us die and continued hunting alone. That takes a kind of courage most people don't have. She chose justice over revenge," Min-ji said, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "That's rare." Kelly looked at his wife with absolute tenderness. "So did you." Min-ji understood he was referring to her parents. To the choice to let them live rather than seeking the revenge that would have been justified. She nodded slowly. "I won't become what they are. No matter what they did." Across town, Selin sat in her new office in Kelly's headquarters building. The space was professional but comfortable, with modern furniture and technology that would have made Owen jealous. On her desk, in a simple silver frame, was a photograph of David, his crooked smile, his serious eyes, taken on the day he'd proposed. She was no longer invisible. No longer just hunting. She was protecting. She had a team, resources, purpose beyond revenge. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by what she'd lost. David always said the job was about protecting people, she thought, her fingers brushing the edge of his photograph. "I thought I'd lost that when I lost him. I thought the only thing left was revenge, was hunting, was making them pay. But maybe this is how I honor him. Not by becoming what they are. Not by letting grief turn me into just another predator. But by stopping them before they take anyone else. By seeing the danger before it arrives. By being the warning that nobody gave David when his time ran out." Maybe this is how I keep my promise. Outside her window, Seattle continued its Sunday morning rhythm, people having breakfast, walking dogs, living ordinary lives without knowing how close violence sometimes came to their doors. And Ellen Anderson, former FBI analyst, former invisible waitress, now director of intelligence, watched over them with eyes that had learned to see danger in the patterns others missed. She was finally, after 3 years of hunting in shadows, doing the job David had always believed in. Protecting people.